Welcome to Dr. Charles Speaks, a podcast for now. Dr. Charles is a nationally recognized Fortune 500 business leader, a former adjunct professor, speaker, and ministry founder. With over 30 years of exceptional performance in both business and ministry, he will share his profound approaches to developing successful leaders. Let's get motivated with Dr. Charles Speaks, inspiring excellence and generating results.
Good day, this is Dr. Charles Redd. I want to thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you this week. I have been pondering this question over the past several days, and the question was, what makes the difference between short-lived leadership and leadership with longevity? That's what I want to talk to you all about today, discovering the secrets of generational leadership. So join me today as we continue to learn and continue to grow and be transformed by the biblical characters I've chosen for today's lesson, Abraham. You may find Abraham's story in the book of Genesis, beginning in chapter 11 and ending in chapter 25. The purpose of this lesson today is to uncover the three secrets. 1, I like to talk about the promise. 2, the sacrifice. And 3, the leap of faith. This all ties to generational leadership, and through the lenses of Abraham and my personal experiences I like to share from. You know, when I think about the story of Abraham, we think back to that 11th chapter and when it all began. He had a choice to make. He was living in comfort. He was living in a place where he had community and he had family and friends, but yet God came to him. He came to Abraham and he asked Abraham to pick up his possessions and take his possessions and go to a distant land. And that was a choice that Abraham had. And we have these choices today. There are really two choices. We can stay where we are and under the security that we have, under the places where we live, the communities that we're involved in, or we can take the step out when God has taken us to the next place. And the next place for Abraham was a distant land. And all he had with him was the support of his wife, his nephew, and his father. And they took this journey. And I think about this journey, along the way, there were these promises that God made, and there were sacrifices made in the midst of the journey. And then, of course, it took a leap of faith to do all that he did, and the time that it took to realize those promises that would come true later in life for Abraham and his family. But the impact that Abraham had on his family was not only just for his family, but for generations to come, because we know Abraham today as the father of many nations. And we have been benefactors of what Abraham has done throughout history. And so when I think about my own experience and background, I remember being at a place in my life and experience where God had come to me, and it made it very clear that he had some things that he wanted me to do and accomplish. And he made promises that went along with that. Those promises sounded very good, and I was very excited about it. But at the time, I was living in my home state of Michigan, in the city of Detroit, and I was pretty much enjoying the creature comforts that I had, the place where I lived, the place where I worked. All of those things were just fine with me. But God challenged me. He called me out. He showed me the promise. He showed me the vision of what would take place. But little did I know it would require some steps, some sacrifices along the way. And so when we think about the promises that God made to Abraham, he told Abraham, he says, look, I'm going to be there. I'm going to defend you and all of the difficulties that you may run into. I'm going to bless you and going to be a blessing to many nations to come. And God even said, I'm going to reveal myself and even to those that are descending after you. So it was a huge promise, and those promises are still relevant today. They're still taking place. They're still in the lives of others. People are realizing the things that God is doing in their lives, and promises are coming true. But when I think about my own personal story in making that move from my hometown to a place called Atlanta, Georgia, a place that I love today, and I've been here many years, but I came here giving up some things, and I gave up family, and I gave up a career opportunity to pursue another career, which was in ministry. And when I came here, I had no job, I had no church to pastor or anything like that, but I knew what God had told me and what he had shared with me, and I was excited about it. It was a blessing also to my wife at the time because she had received a job promotion and was able to move down to Atlanta. So it was a win-win situation, a great promise I heard from God, a vision that I saw that I really was excited about, and an opportunity for my wife to take on more responsibility. But little did I know, when I arrived here in Atlanta, I realized that there was some things that God was going to work in me, through me, and around me before I could realize any of these promises. And one was a humbling experience, instead of being a leader and a manager of a company, I had become a leader and a manager of a household in terms of being a stay-at-home dad. And that was kind of a humbling experience for me, because I never thought I would have to do that, but I certainly didn't mind it, and it certainly impacted my daughter in a positive way. So I was a little excited about that. So I pursued the promise, but it wasn't seemingly fast enough for me. And I can see in the story of Abraham the length of time to realize these promises. And then the impatience of setting in, that when is it going to happen? And just like Abraham, he thought about it, and after so many years, after 10 years, where is all of this going to go? The first thing that he ran into was, one, he got to the land and there was a famine in the land. And then he had to leave that land and go to another place, a place of Egypt, where he was able to find relief and find support. And actually, it turned out to be a good move for him, because he received more abundance to return back to the land where God had sent him in the first place. And so I thought, going to Atlanta, that would be a great place to be. And certainly during the beginning stages of it, it was a humbling experience. But later on in that time, I did get involved in ministry. I had an opportunity to go back to corporate America and work for a very fine company, Coca-Cola company, and had that opportunity. But then things changed. I had an opportunity through a promotion to go back to Detroit. And when I think about that experience, I wonder about it, and should I have made that decision? I felt God was leading me there, but then when I got there, it just didn't seem that everything worked out. And matter of fact, some things turned upside down in the process. And while I got back to Detroit, it was good to be in front of family and friends and get a chance to get back home. But then what I felt was going to take place, it really didn't take place. And actually, my family split up, and my daughter went away to school, and my wife and I, we decided to split up. And so that was a challenging time. It was a period of realizing a promise, but yet having some doubts at that time. And so, having made the sacrifice, that was a bit much for me. So I decided that, Lord, what next? I'm here alone. What am I going to do? Well, I decided that I'm going to sell the home, and I'm going to get back to Atlanta. And I believe God was urging me and giving me the nudge to do that. But certainly it was an uneasy feeling, and it was a feeling of loneliness, because really at that time I really didn't know which way to turn, and doubt started to set in. I imagine the same thing happened with Abraham when God told him, you're going to have a son. And at the time, it took some years before that even could happen. And so I think back to my experience, but I did decide to follow God's leading again, like I did the first time in leaving to go to Atlanta. This time, I took a little extra leap of faith. And that was, I went down on a visit to Atlanta, and I decided, I don't have a job here in Atlanta, and my present company, Coke, is not facilitating me to get back here. But what I'm going to do is, by faith, I'm going to take the leap, and I'm going to purchase a home. And I did, without a job in Atlanta. And I thought in my mind that I would just commute back and forth from Monday through Friday and live at home on the weekend down in Atlanta. But when I got back home, and having put the money down on the new home, put my house in Detroit on for sale, and an interesting thing happened. While I had everything packed up, while everything was ready to go, with a few pieces of furniture left in the home, the house had been sold. The buyer, I didn't know who the buyer was, but I got a knock at the door one particular day, actually the day before the movers were going to move me with the things that I had to Atlanta. And I answered the door. There was a lady who came to the door, and she said, I'm the person who bought your home, and if you don't mind, could I come in and take some measurements? And that, I let her come in, and we talked a little bit, and she saw some pieces of furniture that I had that had not been loaded up yet, and she inquired about them, and I ended up selling them to them and actually making enough money to help facilitate the move altogether. But something strange happened in the conversation. I asked her where did she work and what did she do, and she told me. She worked for a company called Frito-Lay Company, and I happened to know an individual who was already working there that was in another part of the country. And then out of the blue, I really had the audacity at that time to ask her, hey, can you get me a job with Frito-Lay? And she stopped and she paused and she looked at me and she said, sure. And that day, that following couple of days, on that Monday, she wrote a letter of recommendation to the vice president in Atlanta, and I got an interview, and I ended up getting the position and moved. And that was what following God is all about. In regard of the promise, but yet there may be a twist, there may be a turn in our lives, and yet and still He still provides. In this case, when I think about Abraham, even when the sacrifice for him to give up his only son, having waited so long for that promise to fulfill, he did it, and yet God stopped in the midst of it, because what Abraham did, he kept his faith, he kept his trust. But I have to back up the wheel a little bit, because when you think about it, Abraham and Sarah got a little bit impatient at one point of this whole journey. Just like myself, I was impatient and was wondering would it ever even happen, the things that God had shown me. And just like with Abraham and Sarah, they decided to take things in their own hands, and they produced another child named Ishmael. Well, that wasn't the child of promise, but the promise did come. And so we think about life, and we think about the things that God is doing in our lives and the promises that we know God has made personal for us to receive. And yet and still it takes time, and it takes the effort to wait on the Lord. And so when we think about the sacrifice, Abraham, he really had to believe God. He stepped away from his kindred, he stepped away from his community. He made the decision to be obedient and trust God. And that is the key in sacrifice. Even though the promises are what they are, and they're sounding good, and God is He's faithful, and He will deliver on those promises. But what the conditions are for all of us, the conditions lie in trust and hope and faith and obedience. And that is the key that I want to share with you today, is that when you think about these things in your actions, it's one thing to say that you believe, it's another thing to be committed. And in this case, in situations such as this, you have to be committed. And Abraham, I'm sure, just like myself, thinking about giving up, wavering in our faith, but at the same time, becoming to the place where if God said it, I believe it, I'm going to stand on the promises of God, and I'm going to make that leap of faith and go on and see what the end is going to be. And so when we talk about that leap of faith, being separated from your home, that's your comfort zone. That's where, all your friends, and that's where your support is. And you want to be there, and you want to feel that security there. But along this faith journey, there's not going to always have that feeling of everything is just wonderful. But yet and still, we see throughout this story that with Abraham, he held the course in spite of the differences, in spite of the things that he thought it would go, but it did turn out his way. And so when we think about it, many believers today find that when they determine to follow God, that it's not always easy road. And immediately we always seem to come into an encounter of a test in our faith. And in those tests, we realize that in the test itself, it's going to require that resolve and that commitment to continue on the journey that you're on. So the first thing we talked about is the promise. God made those promises. The second thing we talked about is the sacrifice, because there are sacrifices that we all make. But in those sacrifices, it's not to harm us or not to hurt us or not to bring us down. Those sacrifices are to strengthen us and to give us more strength to overcome the obstacles that we come across. And so when everyone else is saying no, yet God has already said yes. And that's the time that we have to stand for something. And if God really be for us, who really can be against us? And if God said it, He certainly will perform it. And so that's the good news today, that one, we can stand on His promises. Two, we can accept the sacrifices that we're going to have to make day in and day out and believe God is going to carry us out. The leap of faith, when I think about the leap of faith and the lady coming to my door, and me having no provision at that time to get to where I was trying to go in terms of a job down in Atlanta. I didn't have anything. I was going to commute, but I just believed somehow, some way, God was going to work it out. My furniture, there were things that I had over the years, keepsakes. I decided to give them all away and just kept a few things just to start up a new place. So God gives us a fresh beginning, a fresh start. It takes the leap. No, you may not see at the bottom, what's at the bottom. But if you jump, I believe God will catch you. And at the end, you will find that it was the best decision that you made. And I think about the decisions. I'm still in the process of this journey. I think about all the years that it took to Abraham to get to the place where these things came to pass. Many years have come and gone by now. But the impact, the decisions that we make today, as we leave with our children and our family, our action speaks louder than our words. When we make these steps and we take these actions, they rub off and they become contagious, and people pick them up and they go and they take these things that we have learned, and that's how we spread the generational leadership. It takes one person to stand up and do it God's way. It takes one person to believe the promises of God. It takes one person to make the sacrifice. It takes one person to take the leap of faith. And when we can do those things, others will follow. What God can do for you, He certainly can do for others. So I'm excited today, having shared with you these key secrets that are generational leadership that is going to affect your today, your tomorrow, and your lives and your legacy as you go forward in life. You will see that if you keep God's promise, if you hold tight to it, and you make the sacrifice that He requires, and that you take the leap of faith, it will all work out for the good. For we know all things work together for good to them that love God and are called according to His purpose. Thank you again for joining me today on today's lesson. I hope it has truly been a blessing to you. This has been Dr. Charles Redd. God bless you.
Thank you for listening to Dr. Charles Speaks. Visit drcharlesredd.com for booking info for your ministry, business, or leadership team. Get info about the Red Line, a 15-minute corporate success call each Monday morning with Dr. Charles. Follow Dr. Charles on all social media at Dr. Charles Redd. Subscribe to the podcast here for every episode of Dr. Charles Speaks. Thanks for joining us. Like Dr. Charles always says, no matter what, never, never, never give up. Until next time.